I got acquainted with the Kennedys when Senator Kennedy, John Kennedy, was a senator from Massachusetts, and he phoned me and asked me if I would represent him, that he was thinking about running for President of the United States, and he was looking for somebody to be his contact man or his point man out in Utah. It was in '57 when he first came out. He was a young senator, and I was surprised that a young senator would get as much traction in a presidential race. He said, "Oscar, when I first came into the Senate, I looked around and I said, what am I doing here with all these great people?" He says, 6 months later, I came in the same Senate floor and I looked around and I said to myself, what are they doing here? One of the nice things about representing national public figures is that when they come into the state of Utah, the high point of their visit is to be able to meet with the presidency of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. President McKay was a very well-informed person on public affairs, and they had a very significant conversation. It wasn't just the normal courtesy call. They talked about significant things. I recall they talked in some detail about how President Kennedy would be able to spread the democratic principles around the world. And as we left, Senator Kennedy turned to me and said, talking of President McKay, that man is ideally suited to be the spiritual leader of his people. After President Kennedy was elected president, I was a young lawyer in Salt Lake and was called upon to go back to Washington and do some legal work. So while I was back there, I was naive and I simply phoned up the president's office. I said that I was in town and I'd like to drop over and see the President of the United States. They kindly explained to me that people don't drop in and see the President of the United States. I said, well, it disappointed me, but would they do me the favor of telling the President that I was here in town? They said they would. I went about my business. By the time I got back to my hotel, there was a telephone call from the office of the President. And the telephone call informed me that the President of the United States had found out that I was in town and that he had rearranged his schedule, and that the next morning at 7 a.m., which was an hour earlier than he usually started his day, that he would see me. Right at 7 o'clock, I was issued in to the Oval Office. And the President of the United States was at his desk, and he looked up and said, "Hello, Oscar." And then the first thing he said to me was, "How is Mr. Fitzpatrick? How is Dr. David O. McKay?" Now, I walk in, he thinks Utah, and the power structure, the president of the church and the owner and publisher of the Tribune, come to his mind, and that's what he asked about. It just kind of gives you an insight to his genius in political thinking. So we had a very nice time, and he was very generous, and we spent an hour together. And at 8 o'clock, he had a time where he was going to sign a huge appropriation bill. He said, Oscar, you'd be interested in this. So I went into a room, and it was filled with reporters and dignitaries, and he signed the Frying Pan, Arkansas Project bill. And the way they sign it, the president takes his pen and he wrote down John. Then he nodded to the chairman of the committee that had handled the bill in the House. and nodded to him, and he came up and he handed him his pen, and then he signed F, and he turned to the chairman of the Interior Committee in the Senate, and he came up and gave him a pen. With a third pen, the president signed Kennedy, and Stuart Udall, who was Secretary of the Interior, stood up, but the president hadn't nodded him to stand up, and so the president turned to me and said, "Oscar, how would you like to have a pen?" And he handed me this pen, so I've got the pen that the President of the United States signed his last name on this huge multi-million-dollar reclamation project. Back to the time when President Kennedy spoke in the Salt Lake Tabernacle. This was a wonderful talk, wonderfully well received, not just in the Tabernacle, but it was broadcast all over the country. And I indicated that he ended up his talk with a quotation from the Doctrine and Covenants and the introduction to the Doctrine and Covenants quotation saying, "As the Lord said to Brigham Young, we shall go as pioneers to a land of peace."
Of all the stories of American pioneers and settlers, none is more inspiring than the Mormon Trail. The qualities of the founders of this community are the qualities that we seek in America, the qualities which we like to feel this country has: courage, patience, faith, self-reliance, perseverance, and above all, an unflagging determination to see the right prevail. And let us remember that the Mormons of a century ago were a persecuted and prosecuted minority, harried from place to place, the victims of violence and occasionally murder, while today, in the short space of 100 years, their faith and works are known and respected the world around, and their voices heard in the highest councils of this country. As the Mormons succeeded, so America can succeed if we will not give up or turn back. And therefore, I think this country will continue its commitment to support the world of freedom, for as we discharge that commitment, we are heeding the command which Brigham Young heard from the Lord more than a century ago, the command he conveyed to his followers: go as pioneers to a land of peace.
After the talk was over, we took President Kennedy immediately down to his car. John Whizzer White, a great All-American football player, represented him in Colorado. In fact, he became an associate member of the United States Supreme Court. And Whizzer was offended at the President of the United States giving such deference to Brigham Young as saying, as the Lord said to Brigham Young, and he said to me, as the Lord said to Brigham Young. And I said to him, Whizzer, you take care of the Gentiles in Colorado, I'll take care of the saints in the state of Utah.